Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co host, Nathan Rittenhouse. Today's episode, we talk about a conversation around a book by Jonathan Rauch, who describes himself as an atheist homosexual Jew, and he's concerned about the future of Christianity. So this ought to be interesting.
And as always, we are a listener-supported podcast and indeed ministry. If you would like to support us financially, you can do that by going to www.toltogether.com and then just click the donate button. But thank you, and we hope this is useful to you. So I want to talk about a gentleman named Jonathan Rauch, who, and I think I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. At least I hope so.
Say it with confidence.
I'll say it with confidence, and then we'll go with that. Jonathan Rauch, author, political commentator. He's written several books, but he was on a podcast recently, and he describes himself as a secular Jew and a homosexual. That said, a little context on him now, a little further context. When he was growing up, he did not have a very high opinion of Christians. And when he was a student at Yale, that changed with a roommate of his. And he said this roommate wasn't perfect by any means, but he walked the walk. He was a genuine Christian in the sense that he displayed genuine Christian charity. There's a word you don't hear too often anymore, but it's an important one, charity.
Good King James language there.
That's right. So truly loving toward his neighbors and toward others and those with whom he disagreed, which would have been Jonathan Rauch himself, obviously. So that was an experience that really was a bit of a paradigm shift for him. But fast forward to 2003, Rauch has the humility to say, and this was spurred on. My thoughts here are spurred on by an interview that he did with Bulwark magazine. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's really worth listening to. But he said in 2003, I wrote one of the stupidest things I ever did, and I published it in The Atlantic. So in 2003, I remember vividly. I'm going to date myself here because that's when I had graduated from high school. Yes, we had our 20-year reunion 2 years ago. So anyway, but he talked about in that article that secularism, and he said the growing secularization is a good thing. We should all be happy about this. We should celebrate the victory of secularization. Well, all of these years later, secularization has continued apace, but Jonathan Rauch is singing a different tune now. He no longer thinks it's a great thing. But what struck me here is that he is pleading with Christians in a new book that he's just published, and on this interview, he's pleading with Christians to behave like Christians. And please follow Jesus rather than cultural or political mandates. Yeah. Let's hear you chime in.
So usually, though, as soon as you hear that as a Christian, you think it's a trap. There's some sense in which some non-Christian wants you to adopt their vision of Christianity in order for you to agree with what it is that they're up to and into and how they want you to vote. So just right off the bat, I want to point out, I don't think that's what he's doing here. But there's enough of that going around that we need to point that out as we go by, that I don't think he has any tricks up his sleeve or any agendas for this is how we can co-opt Christians through their own understanding of their own religious system in order to do our will. So just want to put that caveat in there as we fly by.
And part of the proof of that would be who he talked to write this book. So his latest book, and I'll get the title for you in a second. I have not read it yet. It's just come out. It's still hardback. But
I've got it right here.
Yeah, let's hear it.
It's Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy.
Yes. And so he does argue, by the way, and this harkens back to some of our earlier civilizational conversations about the civilizational benefits of Christianity. He does argue that Christianity is kind of a necessity for democracy. I forget the precise phraseology he uses. He's got a specific phrase that he's using, but he thinks that it's a sort of bulwark.
A load-bearing wall.
That's it. It's a load. He thinks true Christianity, is a load-bearing wall for democracy. So I'll just put that out there for a second. That's worth mulling over. It's worth thinking about that for a little
Can
bit.
I define a load-bearing wall before
Yes,
we go on?
do that.
So a load-bearing wall is a wall that you can't remove without something falling. So,
Mhm.
particularly like an interior wall in your house probably isn't a load-bearing wall, but you can also look at the shape of the roof of your house and decide which wall is on the end, and then which one carries the weight of the roof. And so the whole structure is dependent on a load-bearing wall. I've actually been in houses where people cut out load-bearing walls that were internal load-bearing walls, and the whole like upstairs of the house sinks, and you have to go in and jack it up and put beams in and stuff and
Mhm.
reestablish it. But basically, the idea of a load-bearing wall is exactly what it sounds like. It's a wall that bears the load of the structure around it, and if you remove it, the entire thing collapses. So, yeah, he's pointing back to some of the early constitutional and kind of founding father ideas around the fact that Christianity would provide the necessary moral framework to make a democracy functional, and that if you lost that, that we would essentially become an ungovernable system if you didn't have a Christian moral foundation or a Christianly informed moral foundation. So these are common arguments, Cameron, that I think you would hear from
They
a
are.
lot of religious conservatives. It's just interesting that when you get to somebody who is way outside of the fold also pointing to that, it's noteworthy.
Well, I think it's very convicting when you have somebody who's a non-Christian, right, out of the fold, pleading for Christians to behave like Christians. He's got a number now all the turns of phrase are coming back to me. James Madison, not MAGA. Madison, not MAGA.
Yeah.
Doesn't he say that?
Yeah.
Well, and that
Mhm.
this goes back to the load-bearing wall because the founding fathers and the people responsible, sort of the key architects of the American experiment, they weren't all Christians. That's absolutely true. Some of them were, frankly, basically functional atheists. Some of them were deists. Some of them were Christians. But what they all agreed on, there was consensus that we need a virtuous people to be able to live out this American experiment in liberty.
Mhm.
Non-virtuous people will not be able to handle this. This will collapse into decadence and corruption. So you need people who can self-govern. That's the language that some of the founding fathers use. But in other words, you need people who can display self-control and who can really live out their convictions. And that's part of what he is saying in this podcast. So how do we, Nathan, I mean, how do we respond as Christians when we have non-Christians saying, please act more like Christians? I mean, we all know and we regularly make the case that there are many, numerous faithful churches doing exactly what the Lord has called them to do, not perfectly, but they're living faithful lives and they're making a difference. So I'm just wondering how that hits you though, when a major political commentator and journalist says, "Christians, please behave more like Christians." How can we begin
Uh,
to parse that a little bit?
okay, well, so he makes a distinction here where he thinks that they're, by and large, the majority of Christians are behaving Christianly, and even who was interviewing him? What's her name? Uh, Mona, is it Sharon? Karen?
Yeah,
Karen?
Mona Sharon, I believe.
Mona Sharon.
Yep.
She was saying how when she was in law school that she was blown away by a lot of the work that the Christians around her were doing, particularly taking care of infants that were born
Mhm.
addicted to drugs, and so they all had these they had a high regard for what they saw as actual Christian expression. But they said that what is lacking in the Christian world is a theology of civic engagement. And
Hmm.
so what they were saying is that by and large, churches are churching well, and that Christians are going about their business and the soup kitchens and all of that and the hospitals, but they have no theology of civic engagement that is
Mhm.
Christian. And so he said there's deep discipleship in a lot of categories within American evangelicalism, but not on civic engagement. And so he said, You're kind of, we've run past the time where I can be a total jerk on Twitter, but you should see me at the soup kitchen, and that works. He said, as a non-Christian,
Yep.
we would expect the Christians to embody the beatitudes and the fruit of the spirit in all categories of their life, and we don't see that. So his problem is not with Christianity, it's with the politicization of Christianity, which he sees as bad for Christianity and therefore bad for the country. So he's tracking two movements. And so you're asking, how do we respond as Christians? One is to maybe look at it and be like, you might be right here. he's saying that a lot of the growth right now in American churches is a politicized growth where
Yeah.
you have a culture who identifies the American evangelical church with a rightward shift in politics or the Republic. And this is nothing new here,
Sure. Yeah.
particularly if you've been reading James Davidson Hunter for a decade, like we have. But there's that shift, and then he says the spiritual focus is shifting out of the church. So the political focus is shifting in, and the spiritual focus is shifting out. And he's
Mhm.
looking at the proliferation of the interest in the occult and crystals, and you can go down that whole of people looking for spiritual experience and
Yeah.
engagement, no longer finding that in church, but now people finding political affiliation and identity in the church, and that there's a twofold layer that's developing. You know, he points out that in the last decade, you have more people have left the church than joined during any of the collectively the three American great religious awakenings. He said that in the last year, statistically, 41% of church pastors have considered leaving,
Goodness. Yeah.
stepping outside of pastoral ministry.
Mhm.
And he said, when I talk to them and ask the ones who are sticking it out and staying, they're like, why are you staying? They're saying, well, we are here to pastor. And then here's an interesting line: the church within the church. So the pastors are saying there's a group of people here who are very interested in the teachings of Jesus, in what his life, death, burial, and resurrection, crucifixion, burial, and resurrection have meant for us in our lives. We're trying to format our lives around that, and the leadership is willing to stay to minister and serve that, but also recognize that they're being inundated with a phenomenally um, politically and news driven type of confrontational political engagement that
Mhm.
does not embody the teachings of Jesus in the way in which it interacts with other ideas. So this plays right into the book of I think a lot of the religious language around enemy and winning and taking back and conquering, and you're going to be annihilated by different political parties if you don't win. And so it's a very combative um, political language with religious trappings on it now is something that he sees as not healthy for the future of the church or the
Mhm.
country. And to be fair, he's critical of the liberal rejections of this of and the snobbery on the other side of that too. So equal playing with that. So all this back to your question of how do we as Christians respond? I think we have to just say, is he right in diagnosing what he sees, and if not, why is there that perception?
Yeah, and I think why is there that perception becomes the next question. So, it's true that many Christians lead quiet, faithful lives that are making a massive impact that will never be seen by most people in today's life.
But here's the tricky thing, is that I think most people listening to this podcast fit exactly into that category, and
Mm.
so we are not by and large aware of the junior political conventions that happen in a lot of congregations on Sunday mornings.
Yes, I would
But
agree.
that is real, and we can't stick our heads in the sand and act like that isn't part of the public perception and persona of Christianity right now.
Right, and I think public perception is an incredibly important word because it matters tremendously. So, I think while it's true that there are many laboring faithfully away, sort of unsung heroes, it is also true that the public perception of Christianity is there for a reason. And the truth is that when we look at the representation, the major representations of the church in North America right now, we do get a profoundly, sometimes jaded picture. One that does tell us more about political affiliation, say, than it does about a true expression of charity or just following Jesus. Let me do the usual TOL thing and come about this in a maybe needlessly complex way, but I don't think it is. I think this is helpful to me. So I've been reading Peter Harrison, who's a Australian thinker. He's an intellectual historian. His latest book is called Some New World, which is definitely worth your time. He looks a lot at the history of science. But the one I'm looking at is called The Territories of Religion and Science. I know that just sounds absolutely breathtaking to so
I think
many
you
of
should
you.
say territories.
Yes,
Territories.
Territories, the Territories. Yes, and it's right up there with a Tom Clancy or a Stephen King novel. Let me tell you, it's riveting stuff. But actually, it is helpful. So he's looking at the ancient uses of the word science and religion, so scientia and religio. But here's what's really interesting. Let's think about religio right now. And this does have a bearing on what's going on and on public perception and on, I think, Christian practice in the last 50 years in America. So it I think when we hear the word religion now, that's a very, very broad category, maybe impossibly broad, but we tend to think of a system of belief. And so it's helpful to go back to ancient usage every now and then to see how a current concept has evolved, because that was not how people understood it initially. Religio did not refer to a system of belief or propositions. When it was in usage among pagans and then among Christians and in the early church, it referred to two things primarily: a inward disposition, so we might say the condition of your heart, refer to that, your inward disposition, and then your outward modes of worship, what you did, what flowed from that inward disposition. And that was first and foremost so Christianity, for instance, when it was defended in a document, early documents like those of Justin Martyr or many other early church fathers, they're using Christianity or religio in this sense. So when you have somebody who is behaving in a manner that's contrary to the teachings of Christ, their religion, something was wrong with their religio, or we could also say Christianity. But the takeaway here is it was not a set primarily it wasn't a system of thought. It was not a set of intellectual propositions. Now, that mattered, and the confessions mattered, of course, too. We have the creeds. I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but I'm saying this was a much more holistic conception of a person's way of life. This was Christianity as a way of life. And we've come to
But
a place now where that consistently for a while now, and it's not just in the church, the whole modern turn, starting in the 17th century, was to focus mainly on concepts and to focus mainly on the content of beliefs. And to a significant degree, that's what a lot of Christians will do now. They would, well, I believe in the virgin birth. I believe in the divinity of Christ. I believe in the Trinity. And so I tick all the right boxes. Therefore, I'm a Christian. And essentially, my outward modes of behavior might appear politically idolatrous or vicious toward my enemies, or whatever it is. I don't care. I believe all the right stuff. Therefore, I'm good. That's a caricature, obviously, but there are hints of truth in that as well. So that's where I think we need to. Jonathan Rauch helps us to awaken. Hey, do we are we truly following our Lord? Is this more than just a set of intellectual commitments? Is this a way of life? And do we believe that there's no one else to whom we can go but Christ because he has the words of life? Nathan.
so here, two things here. One is that Justin Martyr could not have imagined a world in which the church had political power
Sure. Yeah.
when there wasn't even, and and I think this is part of what Roush is pointing out, that Christianity has struggled mightily to know what it is to wield power Christianly.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, let's be clear, in our last election cycle, that was one of the things. If you vote for me, I will give you power and revenge.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just saying those are hard concepts to reconcile with Christianity, as a form of political engagement. Now, here's where things get a little interesting for me in his analysis here, is
Mm-hmm.
that he points out that he thinks that the church that has done the best with its civic theology
Yeah.
is the Church of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
So here you go. So he's going to throw one for the Mormons, who he say, if you look at, for example, Utah, the state of Utah, they have um, far more conservative than a lot of states. Obviously, have more, say, in his case, he was interested in the right to marriage type acts of treatment of gay and homosexual people, and they have deeper protections for and religious exemptions for um, religious belief and for churches and organizations. And he's like, that's because the Mormon Church, the Church of the Latter Day Saints, negotiated very carefully and reached an agreement that protected their rights and extended liberties to people they disagreed with in a way that set up a pretty good foundation for the way for the state to be run to take care of everybody, and did not view it as a winning and losing type conversation. And he said that created a lot of tension with evangelicals and Catholics who are like, no, this is not the way to do it. And the Mormon church, but he said, ironically, the Mormon church walked away with more by trying to um, have a civic theology. Now, the difference here is that it's way easier because the Church of Latter Day Saints is a centrally controlled organization, and they can be like, "This is how everybody should do it, and this is how we're going to do it." You can't do that for
Mhm.
however many million independent evangelicals. So that element and that point there is not really a similar parallel. But I think it's interesting that he's somebody who sees that as a good example of how this can be done, both in the sense that is it's understanding that the the entirety of what makes up our society is not just religious, that it does have a number of civil parameters wrapped around it. So he thinks that the Church of Latter day Saints does a better job of balancing those things out in order to protect their own religious convictions while extending liberties that are outside of their religious tradition that are in keeping with the broader constitutional understanding of what it means to be um, a state and a religious network within a state. Um, Now, let me say one more thing on the Mormons, and we'll keep going here. Is that and get you to comment on this? Is that he says that actually, as somebody who grew up as part of, well, not grew up, but now identifies and advocates for the LGBTQ issues, that the minorities are always the one that have the prophetic voices of critique against the majority. And he said that the Mormons absolutely see themselves in that posture as well, but very much have a like, okay, we're the minorities and we're persecuted, but so what? We're still going to keep on doing what we do and what we think is right. And so he, I think, is longing for the church to step back into that understanding of it being a more of a prophetic witness on the edge than adulterating itself with political power. And so that's in I'll have to think through what I think about all of that, but it's interesting that he makes that connection and that connotation and highlights the Latter-day Saints in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to, as you pointed out, consider that Justin Martyr would never have imagined a church with any high degree of power at all. So, while we can let's bracket the Mormonism comments for just a second on that because yeah, that is a very intriguing point that can possibly be a bit distracting, but his larger point, I think, stands that Christians need to recognize that historically, and I think this is nothing new. We've said this on the podcast many times, and we're not the only ones saying this. This has been said many times over. And also, it's the case globally. Christianity is usually on the margins. Christians are usually, if not a persecuted minority, then a small, kind of a strange group of people who are at best tolerated. I mean, that's the normal lot of Christians in a given culture and society. So I think when we recognize that and when we internalize that, part of what he's getting at is we're less likely to compromise and we're less likely, well, to compromise our convictions to try to hold on to political power. Now, what's interesting is he's walking a fine kind of line here. There's a little balancing act that's taking place with him because, on the one hand, he's arguing that Christianity, truly practiced, is a load bearing wall for democracy. So that puts him a little bit in the civilizational camp, I think. I want Christians to be around because of their social benefits. It's a really helpful social glue. It promotes the right kind of virtue that keeps a democracy running smoothly, you know, regardless of its truth or not. Both you and I, Nathan, are a little bit leery of that. And I think a lot of many Christians are because they think, okay, yeah, praising Christianity for its social benefits is, I mean, obviously not quite ideal. But on the other hand, I mean, Christianity has, we believe, a true anthropology and a true conception of human beings and human life and human flourishing. Therefore, it makes sense that to a certain extent, it's going to promote a kind of harmonious living. But in other ways, it's going to push profoundly against the culture because we have no other Lord but Christ, I mean, this was the tension of the early church and the Roman Empire initially. There were so many bizarre cults and sects in the Roman Empire, and they were all, embraced. It was great. But Christians were a problem. There were vicious rumors spread about them because they were seen as seditious because they didn't worship Caesar ultimately. They were something greater than the empire for them, something greater than that sphere of power. And so that same principle applies today. That always puts the Christian, whoever he or she is, at odds with some of the prevailing societal norms, the status quo. Hence the perennial marginalization. So I think we can say Christianity, properly practiced, is going to promote some wonderful things. I mean, it's good, yeah, virtue, but those are outworkings, those are byproducts. But on the other hand, it's going to create some hardships too.
Well, and
Yeah.
and let's be clear, he's not painting an overly rosy picture of Christianity. He fully acknowledges and
Yes. Yeah.
articulates the tensions and the difficulties that he sees. So he's not whitewashing it at all, but he's saying on the total sum of things that it does provide a comprehensive view of reality that is culturally stabilizing, unlike a lot of other spiritual expressions or things that would unify people culturally. So that's an important thing to keep in
Yeah.
mind here. To follow up on one thing you're saying there, Sunday I preached a sermon. Well, it was one of the beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And a number of commentators and people have pointed out that when you look at it, this idea of hungering and thirsting for righteousness is that by and large we live in a culture that hungers and thirsts for blessedness. So we're hungering and thirsting for happiness. We're not hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And in this civilizational, is Christianity civilizationally good conversation? The hesitation that you mentioned, and I just want to articulate here, is that forming a functional democracy maybe is a byproduct of the
Hmm.
application of Christian virtues and values, but it is not the core goal or vision of doing so.
Hmm.
And so this fits kind of into a broader cultural thing where we always want to bypass the cause and get straight to the byproduct. And
Hmm.
so Jesus is saying, you hunger and thirst for righteousness, and you will be filled and you'll be blessed, not you hunger and thirst for the blessedness and then you get it. So I, that's the thing. Like, so I think we can take the non-Christian perspective of this and be like, well, thanks for noticing, while at the same time saying that's a terrible reason to pursue Christianity in and of itself because it's I think it's a very sneaky thing because it plays right back into the what do I get out of this if I worship Christ
Hmm.
mindset. That is the problem in the first place, where we're trying to use Christ as a means to our own ends. And so just be careful there as you're listening to this and as you see more and more, I think non-Christians saying, actually, Christianity is a load-bearing wall. It is foundational to our civilization. It's the Tom Holland Dominion type stuff, or Jordan Peterson and the rest of them. Yeah, it is, but that's not the primary goal. That's a derivative and a byproduct of the original intent of what it is that Christ was calling us to. So, um, as we kind of come down the home stretch on that, let's just keep this whole category in the back of our
Hmm.
minds as a neat, but not again, not the goal.
Hmm. I think that's a good way of putting it. Neat, but not the goal. And it's hard to, again, do we want Christians to have a voice in the life of the nation and in public affairs? Ideally speaking, yes, absolutely. But if we come to places where in our own lives or in our own careers where gaining that voice would come at the cost of our convictions, we need to be willing to say the cost is too high. Now, I think there is still right. And that's not a fun point to make.
Crucifixion is an option.
Absolutely, crucifixion is an option. Take up your cross. But at the same time, let's say something encouraging here. It's encouraging that somebody like Jonathan Rauch views full-blooded Christians as not only a help, but as essential to democracy and to this country. That's a good thing that we have people like that who recognize the legitimacy of Christian voices. He's, again, a smart man who has really is doing himself certainly no cultural favors by making a statement like that and then writing a full book about that as well. Certainly that will come at some social cost for him, especially a member of, of the gay community, saying, "Hey, we want more Christians around." That's a bold statement, but he's not alone. There are plenty of other people who recognize that. And you know what else that means? That means that people are still open to persuasion as well. Because I mean, obviously, people like like us, you listeners and Nathan and I would love to see somebody like Roush become a Christian as well, and
Yeah,
would
come on in. The water's fine.
great. And I mean, to take the conversation further and say, well, yes, you recognize some of its wonderful social outworkings, some of the beauty of what we call discipleship. So might that not count as some kind of powerful clue or even evidence of the veracity of Christianity? We should talk more about that. And in fact, that seems to be that kind of approach. That seems to be, this is a parting thought that could be another podcast. Maybe we can talk about it later. I think that's the new evidential apologetics of our moment right now. It's the proof is in the pudding kind of stuff to see a transformed life. So that harkens back to the earliest apologists, the Peter saying, "Set apart Christ as Lord in your hearts, and then be prepared for all the questions that come your way, because you've set apart Christ as Lord in your heart, and you're a saint." People have a lot of questions for saints. Some of them are, "How dare you?" and "Who do you think you are?" But some of them are, "What? How did you respond so well to such hostility or adversity? My goodness, what makes you tick?" Those are apologetic questions, and they flow. They're occasioned by the inward disposition of a person who's transformed from the inside out. So I think there's a huge word of encouragement here for all of us. People are still open to persuasion. People do want to have those conversations. And yes, people on the other side of some of the deepest divides culturally want to talk about this and are willing to publish books defending our right to have a voice. That's a big deal. So I think
There you
it's
go.
also encouraging.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.